Hello everyone, this is Rakesh. You are most welcome. Today is day 10. Now, today we will study about was and were. We have to pronounce were as were or were. In English, in spoken English, we have to pronounce were. That's it. आपको were को were पढ़ना है. were pronounce करना है. Okay. Two rhymes were. Two rhymes were. Two rhymes were. Okay. Now, was is a singular verb. Was singular verb है and with singular verb we have to use singular subject. Actually with singular subject के साथ यदि एक वस्तु या व्यक्ति हो, so we have to use singular verb. Was is a singular verb, so we have to use was with राम. राम के साथ was का यूज होगा क्योंकि राम एक व्यक्ति है. राम वॉच, राम वॉच, टी वॉज. मैंने कहा था अनकाउंटेबल नाउन सिंगुलर होते हैं. So tea was, tea watch. Now look at here. With plural subject we have to use plural verb. Plural subject के साथ we have to use plural verb. Where plural verb है, so two rams were. Tea and coffee were. You have to pronounce again and again. So my dear friends, as we all know, we use was with I was. We were. You have to practice with me. You were. Singular हो या plural हो, we have to use were with you. You के साथ were ही यूज होता है, चाहे एक हो या एक से ज़्यादा हो. He was, she was, they were. Where नहीं, were, they were. It was. You have to practice like this. I was. We were. You were. It was. He was. She was. They were. Now look at some sentences. Affirmative sentence. As we all know, affirmative sentence starts with subject. I have written I here. With I we have to use was. I have already told you. I was a doctor. I have written Hindi. You can read it. I was a doctor. Interrogative sentence starts with helping verb. So first of all I have written was here. मैंने was लिखा है. Was I a doctor? Was I a doctor? क्या मैं एक चिकित्सक था? Was I a doctor? You have to pronounce it. You have to practice with me. Was I a doctor? You have to repeat the sentences like this. If you are not an English medium student, you have to practice like this. If you are a Hindi medium student, you have to practice like this. Okay. Now, in negative sentence starts with subject. Affirmative and negative sentences start with subject. With I we have to use was. I have already told you. I was not a doctor. मैं डॉक्टर नहीं था. Interrogative sentence starts with helping verb. Was I not a doctor? You have to practice the sentences like this. Okay, now look at here. These are WH questions. WH questions starts with WH words plus helping verb plus subject. Okay, आप क्या थे? First of all I have written WH words, then helping verb. Helping verb means was or were. Actually we are studying about was and were. There are almost 27 helping verbs in English grammar. Today we will have to focus on was or were. So look at here. आप क्या थे? What were you? Where को वह पढ़ना है. What were you? आप कैसे थे? How were you? आप कैसे थे? How were you? आप कहाँ थे? Where were you? आप कौन थे? Who were you? Who were you? So, my dear friends, here are some sentences to practice. Look at here. So, you have to practice with me. Were you? First of all, you have to speak like this. Were you? Were you? Were you? Were you happy? Were you happy? Were you happy? Yes, I was happy. Yes, I was happy. Yes, I was happy. Were you rich? Were you rich? Were you rich? Were you rich? Yes, I was rich. Yes, I was rich. Were you hungry? Yes, I was hungry. Yes, I was hungry. Were you fine? Yes, I was fine. Were you fine? Yes, I was fine. Were you sad? Yes, I was sad. Were you sad? Yes, I was sad. Were you happy? Were you happy? क्या आप खुश थे? Were you happy? No, I was not happy. No, I was not happy. No, I was not happy. Were you rich? क्या आप धनी थे? No, I was not rich. No, I was not rich. No, I was not rich. Were you hungry? No, I was not hungry. No, I was not hungry. Were you fine? No, I was not fine. No, I was not fine. Were you sad? No, I was not sad. Were you sad? No, I was not sad. Were you a doctor? Were you a doctor? डॉक्टर नहीं, डॉक्टर. ट आर से पहले वोबल हो तो आर इज साइलेंट देयर, आर वहाँ साइलेंट होता है. Were you a doctor? Were you a doctor? Yes, I was a doctor. Yes, I was a doctor. Yes, I was a doctor. Were you a farmer? Were you a farmer? Yes, I was a farmer. Yes, I was a farmer. Were you a leader? Were you a leader? Yes, I was a leader. Yes, I was a leader. Were you a businessman? Were you a businessman? Yes, I was a businessman. Yes, I was a businessman. Excuse me, were you a doctor? No, I was not a doctor. No, I was not a doctor. Excuse me, were you a farmer? क्या आप एक किसान थे? Were you a farmer? No, I was not a farmer. No, I was not a farmer. Excuse me, were you a leader? क्या आप नेता थे? क्या आप नेता थे? No, I was not a leader. No, I was not a leader. Were you a businessman? क्या आप एक businessman थे? No, I was not a businessman. No, I was not a businessman. Excuse me, gentlemen. Were you an engineer? Were you an engineer? Yes, my dear friends, I was an engineer. Yes, my dear friends, I was an engineer. Excuse me, gentlemen. Excuse me, my friend. Were you an actor? Were you an actor? Yes, I was an actor. Yes, I was an actor. Yes, I was an actor. Excuse me. Were you an officer? Were you an officer? Yes, I was an officer. Yes, I was an officer. Excuse me. Were you an artist? क्या आप एक कलाकार थे? Yes, I was an artist. Yes, I was an artist. Excuse me. Were you an engineer? Were you an engineer? No, I was not an engineer. No, I was not an engineer. Were you an actor? Were you an actor? No, I was not an actor. Were you an officer? No, I was not an officer. I was not an officer. Excuse me, were you an artist? No, I was not an artist. No, I was not an artist. Excuse me, were they fine? Were they happy? Were they happy? क्या वे लोग खुश थे? Yes, they were happy. Yes, they were happy. They were happy. Yes, they were happy. Were they rich? Were they rich? Yes, they were rich. Were they hungry? Yes, they were hungry. Were they fine? Yes, they were fine. Were they sad? Yes, they were sad. Excuse me, my dear friends, were they happy? Were they happy? No, they were not happy. They were not happy. They were not happy. Were they rich? No, they were not rich. Were they hungry? No, they were not hungry. They were not hungry. Were they fine? No, they were not fine. Were they sad? No, they were not sad. Excuse me, gentlemen. Were they doctors? Were they doctors? क्या वे लोग डॉक्टर थे? Were they doctors? No. Yes, they were doctors. Yes, they were doctors. Were they farmers? Yes, they were farmers. Yes, they were farmers. Were they leaders? Were they leaders? Yes, they were leaders. Yes, they were leaders. Were they actors? Were they actors? Yes, they were actors. Yes, they were actors. You have to practice with me, okay? So again, were they doctors? No, they were not doctors. They were not. They were not. They were. They were not. You have to practice with me like this. They were. They were not. They were not doctors. They were not doctors. They were not doctors. Were they farmers? No, they were not farmers. They were not farmers. They were leaders. No, they were not leaders. Were they actors? No, they were not actors. Excuse me, was he naughty? Was he naughty? क्या वह नटखट था? Was he naughty? Yes, he was naughty. Yes, he was naughty. Yes, he was naughty. Was he poor? Yes, he was poor. Was he thin? Yes, he was thin. Was he sad? Yes, he was sad. Yes, he was sad. Was he hungry? क्या वह भूखा था? Yes, he was hungry. Yes, he was hungry. Excuse me, was he naughty? Was he naughty? No, he was not naughty. He was not naughty. He was not naughty. Excuse me, was he poor? No, he was not poor. No, he was not poor. Was he thin? No, he was not thin. Was he sad? No, he was not sad. Was he hungry? No, he was not hungry. Excuse me, was his brother your neighbor? Was his brother, क्या उसका भाई आपका पड़ोसी है? Was his brother, you have to speak like this. Was his brother. In place of brother, you can use any other word. Sister, father, mother, friend. Was his brother, was his friend, was his brother, was his friend, was his sister, was his dad, was his mom, your neighbor. आपका पड़ोसी था. Was his brother your neighbor? Was his brother your neighbor? Yes, his brother was my neighbor. Yes, his brother was my neighbor. Excuse me, was his brother your friend? क्या उसका भाई आपका दोस्त था? Yes, his brother was. Yes, his brother was my neighbor. Yes, his brother was my friend. Yes, his brother was my friend. Excuse me, was his brother your chum? Yes, his brother was my chum. Excuse me, was his brother your neighbor? Was his brother your neighbor? No, his brother was not my neighbor. No, his brother was not my neighbor. You have to speak like this. His brother was not, his brother was not my neighbor. His brother was not my neighbor. His brother was not my neighbor. His brother was not my friend. His brother was not my chum. You have to speak like this. Excuse me, was his brother your neighbor? Was her brother, here is her. Was her brother your neighbor? Yes, her brother was my neighbor. Yes, her brother was my neighbor. Was her brother your enemy? Yes, her brother was my enemy. Was her brother your friend? Yes, her brother was my friend. Yes, her brother was my friend. Excuse me, was my brother, क्या मेरा भाई your neighbor, आपका पड़ोसी था? Was my brother your neighbor? Was my brother your neighbor? Yes, your brother was my neighbor. Yes, your brother was my neighbor. Yes, your brother was my neighbor. Excuse me, was my brother your classmate? Yes, your brother was my classmate. Yes, your brother was my classmate. Excuse me, was your brother your neighbor? No, your brother was not my neighbor. Your brother was not my neighbor. Excuse me, was my brother your classmate? Was my brother your classmate? No, your brother was not my classmate. That's all, my friend. Bye bye, take care. Jai Hind.